Greetings everybody, my name is Constanza Carreño. I am a 5th year student of English Pedagogy at Ucsc, and this is my Hito Evaluativo 3. Well, firstly, I would like to provide some context on what this presentation will be about. Basically, Hito Evaluativo 3 is the final evaluation of my major's program, which consists of assessing the process of planning and implementing a unit during my professional practice. Well, I did my professional practice at Colegio Concepción Hualqui, a private subsidized institution in which all of the students come from different sociocultural backgrounds. I taught lessons from 7th grade to 11th grade. However, I decided to implement my unit with 7th grade A, which had around 37 students. It's worth mentioning that the school had a great availability of resources, which helped me to implement my unit in the best way possible. As well, I would also like to mention that my students' level of English went from A1 to B1 according to the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So, as a way of getting to know my students better, I carried out a needs analysis, which, according to Hariadi and Yanti, could be described as an instrument that aligns or tries to match the expectations that the curriculum or teachers have about their students with their students' or learners' needs. So, at the beginning of the process, I handed my students a printed version of the questionnaire that you can see here, including questions related to their interests, their experience with the language, as well as their motivation towards English, amongst others. Well, overall, I would say that this process helped me to comprehend what type of activities and strategies work best for them and which ones I should apply in order for my students to have a successful learning experience. Taking into account the results obtained, I developed a unit plan aimed at the production of a written piece of news about a topic of the students' interests. They were given opportunities to practice all of the skills, as you can read here in the general objective, but the idea was for them to enhance the productive ones. Thus, in order to make sure that my students would acquire the required knowledge, I divided the unit into 8 lessons, always considering scaffolding. The main unit's assessment consisted of a task-based learning product aligned with the topic of news. And as it can be seen here, the majority of the objectives are related to productive skills and are clear enough so that students could understand what they are requested to do. Moving on, the needs analysis also provided me with a lot of insight on what type of activities or strategies students were interested in. Therefore, the implementation of ICTs was paramount to engage them towards the lesson. I also incorporated a lot of interactive activities and contextualized examples so that they could relate to the content. And in this way, I believe that they felt more comfortable and confident with their learning process. For example, as it is shown here, I work with a lot of videos and visual aids, such as games from web pages like WordWall, Kahoot, and others, which also brings me to the next aspect. So these types of activities mentioned before made possible that the lessons were accessible to all of my students from 7th grade. In fact, I based the adjustments on the UDL guidelines by CAS 2024, making sure not only that the material used was appropriate, but also that instructions were provided both written and orally, that students were allowed to experience with different types of interactions, such as individual or peer work, and that learners with, for example, visual impairment were not left behind, so that for instance, the fonts of all of my PowerPoint presentations were big enough so that even my students at the very back could see. On the other hand, I mostly implemented formative assessments in relation to working class, on feedback and also on the watchback principle. The idea was to gain insight on the students' perceptions and reaction towards the material and the content that were carried out. Nonetheless, I also incorporated summative assessment. For instance, the students were required to write a piece of news, which later would be displayed in a poster and then would be presented orally. Besides that, the learners were requested to answer a self-assessment checklist as a way of giving them more freedom and participation on their evaluation process. And here is an example of the rubric used to assess a students' work. As mentioned before, I carried out a task-based learning assessment since, well, this student-centered approach demonstrates to be very effective when providing students with opportunities to use the language in context, according to Ha et al. I also decided to implement a task-based learning approach since this is what was expressed by students through the needs analysis questionnaire. In fact, they prefer those types of evaluations in pair or groups. So I believe that it was a good idea to make them feel comfortable during the assessment stage of the unit. And regarding the cultural and linguistic factors, first of all, I decided to write the needs analysis questionnaire in Spanish so that every student could understand each question, in this way guaranteeing that the answers were aligned with the realities. Secondly, it was important for me to know their preferences about the strategies and topics, as well as the value that they give the language and how frequently they use it in their everyday lives. Therefore, the cultural and linguistic factors identified allowed me to create lessons that were adequate to their ages, their level of English, their interests, among others. And to achieve this, contextualization and authentic materials were very important. Moving on to the reflection, I would say that after carrying out the unit's final task, I identified many areas for improvement. But in this presentation, I included only 2 of them, which I believe are the most important ones. For instance, regarding the task-based learning approach, I believe that it would have been more beneficial for my students if I had provided them with more personalized feedback, which was not really possible due to the amount of time, lack of time constraints, and also the class size. As well, I believe that the task correctly addressed the students' needs, as it included more than one way of assessing and it encouraged peer and collaborative work. However, it was not as successful as I thought it would be, considering the improvement of the speaking skill. This mostly due to the lack of immersion in the English language context. Therefore, in future lessons, I would try to enhance communication in English, this through either vocabulary phrases or other types of strategies. Well, on the other hand, I can highlight that the use of information and communication technologies was a very important factor when ensuring that the students were engaged towards the lesson, as it, let's say, also allowed me to cover a variety of topics and interests within the classroom, demonstrating that I knew my students and that I took into account their preferences. Now, regarding areas for growth, I would say that I need to work on my classroom management strategies and in a better implementation of the UDL guidelines, since there's always room for improvement and there are more ways in which we as teachers can embrace diversity. So perhaps it could be very useful to get acquainted with this topic in a more profound way. On the contrary, I believe that I was able to incorporate a variety of strategies, techniques, and activities into my unit plan, which not only demonstrated my knowledge, but also benefited my students' learning experiences and also nurtured our teacher-student relationship, which is very important since it fosters, let's say, trust from both sides. I am aware that it's paramount that students believe in the expertise of their teacher, but also that teachers believe on their students' abilities. And well, with all of that said, I would also like to point out that this semester has been one of the most challenging for me, and likewise that it has been the one who has provided me with the most important learning experiences that have impacted on my goals and on my, let's say, expectations for my professional future. And I have always believed that teachers are somewhat the backbone of society, and that it's in our hands to make changes and an impact on our students' lives. So I would like to continue nurturing that path and that mindset, and seeking opportunities to improve not only my knowledge, but also to foster my abilities, my communication skills, guaranteeing that learning becomes a fun and interesting adventure, not only for students, but also for myself as a teacher. Now you can see the bibliography, including the authors and the organizations that were mentioned throughout the presentation, which now has reached its ending. Thank you so much for listening.